reduce prejudice and anxiety in interaction of all kind. So by using a relational density framework, we examine how participants relate world cultures with positive and negative approachability characteristics. The current study had 177 undergraduate participants, ranging from people in their first year to those about to graduate. These students were recruited from psychology courses at Missouri State. The study was administered remotely through Qualtrics, in which participants were asked to complete a procedure involving 136 pairwise stimulus. The stimulus used 8 approachability characteristics and 8 countries from around the world. For the approachability stimuli, we used sociable, friendly, trustworthy, and sincere for positive characteristics, and then we used incompetent, defensive, unfriendly, and threatening for negative characteristics. The countries chosen were among some of the top countries to send international students to the United States during the 2021-22 school year, which include Canada, Mexico, Nigeria, India, South Korea, China, and Iran. Participants were then asked to complete a willingness scale, in which they rated on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all and 10 being most willing, on how willing they were to interact with the individuals from each country. The MDS maps for the all participants can be seen under figures under Figure 1. Figure 2 is the MDS map for all participants who have left the country before, while Figure 3 is the MDS map for all participants who have never left the country. Lastly, Figure 4 is the willingness scale results for all participants. All their scores were averaged. The black bar is for all participants. The dark gray bar is for participants who have left the country. And the light gray bar is for participants who have never left the country. In all 3 of the MDS maps, the location of all the stimuli are relatively similar. There are just some slight changes between the maps, especially when comparing those who have left the country versus those who have not. For those who have never left the country compared to those who have, those who have not rated America and Canada slightly closer to the positive characteristics, while rating the other 6 countries slightly closer to the negative characteristics. Overall, participants rated the North American countries closest with the positive characteristics, while the other countries had more of a wide range towards the bottom of the MDS map. The closest countries to the negative characteristics on all 3 maps were China, Iran, South Korea, and then India. And then on the willingness scale, those who have never left the country rated North American countries and India higher than those who have left the country on average. Going back and kind of highlighting the countries closest to the negative characteristics, as well as kind of lower on the willingness scale, that being China, South Korea, Iran, and India, those 4 countries alone make up about 60% of all international students in the United States. China itself is rated closest to the negative characteristics and is by far the #1 country to send international students to the United States, which kind of follows our hypothesis and current literature showing that there is a gap in willingness to interact with other local students opposed to more international students. While the results are pretty interesting, they can't be generalized very well just because of the nature of multidimensional scaling, since it is just a snapshot picture of all the participants on relation, and everyone is different due to different learning histories. Furthermore, the study was given remotely, so there's no oversight for the participants. Since participants were offered extra credit, they easily could have just rushed through randomly instead of reading each question. But the study does bring a lot of future research, wanting to extend more past just psychology students, especially reaching out to international students and ethnic students, falling more specific on willingness to interact in different settings, namely academic settings or social settings. And lastly, willingness to engage with individuals given the knowns and unknowns of different situations, especially with how those will affect the individuals from different cultures. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. I'm actually curious about how you measured. So when you say the participants had to complete this MDS procedure with approachability characteristics, I just don't really know how that works. So do they see the 2 stimuli and they have to say which one's the friendly, which one's the, is that how it works?
So when they went through the pairwise stimulus, the pictures that I have at the bottom of the methods, it just is there just to make sure that they know where that country is. And then they're asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how related each of those countries is with each of the 8 characteristics, and then again with each other. So in the case of like Canada, which is closest to the positive, on average, people would relate like sociable, friendly, trustworthy, sincere highly with the Canada stimulus, so like 9 or 10. But when it came to like China, they would relate it lower, such as China and sociable were rated like 3 or 2 compared.
Right, okay. All right. Should we move on to the next poster?
All right,
We
can
can see your
everyone see
poster
that?
here.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Great.
Yep.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Campbell. I recently graduated from my master's program in applied behavior analysis at Utah Valley University. And this fall, I will be attending the clinical psychology program at Missouri State. Today, I'll be discussing my poster on relational density theory and the subsequent resistance. Relational density theory is an extension on relational frame theory that attempts to explain relational networks by using Newtonian classical mechanics, or as a professor once told me, think of it like relational frame theory and behavior momentum had a baby, and that baby is relational density theory. Research has shown that the greater mass networks with high volume and density are more resistant to change. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the relative degree of change of a relational network when introduced to a strategic disruptor. In this study, we had 29 participants from UVU and the general population that were recruited by research assistants. Participants were randomly assigned to two groups. We had a disruptor group and a coherence group. Each group completed a Qualtrics survey where they rated stimuli and completed stimulus pairing observation procedures. Similar to what Ryan mentioned, they were shown a stimulus and it would have to rate from one scale of 1 to 10 to all the other stimuli. Each group completed the Qualtrics where they rated those, and then within the Qualtrics survey, each participant completed the multi-dimensional scaling procedures, like I mentioned, the A to B trainings in the form of a stimulus pairing observation procedure, where one stimulus was shown, another stimulus was shown right after, and then a blank slide, and then another stimulus and another stimulus. And then they completed another scaling procedure. Then they were either introduced to a coherence training or disruptor training, and then followed by a third scaling procedure, again, where they rated each stimuli to each other. The Qualtrics survey took about 30 to 40 minutes to complete. So the first MDS results you can see on the first two graphs side by side. For both groups, we see three distinct classes formed as shown on the graphs for both of the groups. We have a distinct castle people group with our stimuli like king, queen, peasant, jester, and due to their previous learning history, everyone related those very closely. Similarly, we have our spices group where they related sage, basil, salt, and pepper also very closely. And then we have a third distinct relational class that you see there, which was the arbitrary stimuli. So it's different symbols found on the computer, like a circle with a line above it, things like that, that they haven't had experience with. The A to B training then was a stimulus pairing observation procedure where each stimuli was paired with an arbitrary stimulus. So for example, the word king had a specific arbitrary stimuli that we paired it with. And so on and so forth for queen and peasant and jester and the spices. After that training, they then did the MDS procedure again, and you can see in the two graphs below, the results showed successful merging of two relational classes for both the groups. Then after that, after those two groups were established, we were then looking at, okay, what happens if you place a strategic disruptor? So the coherence group was given a stimulus pairing observation procedure, again, with coherent relations like king matches queen, things that they already knew that was reinforcing their pre-established relations. The disruptor group was then given a random stimulus pairing procedure video where stimuli were presented in random, non-coherent order. So maybe salt was paired with queen or king was paired with the wrong arbitrary stimuli, acting as this random disruptor. After the final phase, the MDS results, they then completed the MDS scale, again, relating all the stimuli, and it showed consistent responding. As you can see on those third set of graphs between both groups, it showed consistent responding between both groups with neither group's relational networks being disrupted. These results continue the research and the findings of high density relational networks being more resistant to change. It seems that while disruptor group was shown in incorrect random relations, they relied on their previously established knowledge, and thus those relational networks stayed the same and they stayed dense. The relational networks formed were dense enough that a random disruptor was not able to create that change in the network. The density of these networks may be attributed as well to the learning history of already known stimuli like king and queen and peasant and the subsequent spices. The second portion of the study is currently in process. Participants have been recruited and have completed the survey, and the data is in the process of being analyzed. This second study looked at how a random disruptor may affect less dense networks, such as networks formed with completely all arbitrary stimuli. Like instead of king and queen, which were already known stimuli, made up words like biv and jep. We hypothesize that a random disruptor will create a change in a less dense relational network because of this. Current researchers of RFT are looking at the applicability of relational density theory to real-world issues like biases. It is important to understand to what degree of disruptor is needed to disrupt problematic relational networks, specifically problematic relational networks that are harmful to society. Random information may not be enough to change dense relational networks. If we can determine what degree of disruptor, we can begin to disrupt and reteach harmful relational networks in which everyone in life faces. Future research can explore the degree of strength required for a disruptor in order to produce changes in relational networks and figure out what exactly we need in order to disrupt these dense networks. Thank you all for listening and for everyone's continual work on progressing the research on RFT and helping make the world a better place.
Oh, thank you. Jonathan, do you have any questions specifically?
Well, because of the stimulus pairing observation procedure?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering why do you do the stimulus pairing observation procedure, not just a typical matching to sample procedure? Just out of curiosity.
We did a replication on a previous study that was done by, and so we just kind of copied their stimulus pairing procedure and replicated that. So.
Killen.
Yeah, sorry, you said there wasn't a disruption by certain novel stimuli. Did you ever look at the Waterdown paper?
Sorry.
So basically they did a study with Northern Irish participants where the learning history here, when they presented a socially loaded name, which was never used during the training with other socially loaded stimuli, it completely disrupted the classes. But whenever they did it with English people, the same effect didn't happen. So I'm curious, what novel stimuli did you use?
The novelty, I don't know if you guys have heard of like the wingdings on your like Word or Google Docs if you insert just random novel. So we just picked from there and chose some really strange ones that we assumed that no one really had any interactions with.
Okay.
All right, thanks so much, Michaela. Let's move on. Who's next?
All right, let me get mine set up real quick.
Right, we can see your. We are going to be able to see your poster soon.
Okay. 1 second, I'm not sure why it's not pulling up with the actual poster itself. Let's see. Give me just 1 second, I apologize. Whenever you guys were able to see it, did it have information on it? On my side, it didn't have any information on the actual poster.
Blank template, I think.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. That's the problem that I think I'm running into, but let me try to see if I can get, I'm not used to Teams. I'm more used to Zoom, and so I'm trying to figure out kind of how this one works real quick.
Just while you were doing that, I just received an email from Victoria saying that there are goodies for the presenters under the table with the sandwiches. So there should be something for you and for you. And there should be something for Jordan as well, but he's a little far away to get it. Right, we can see your poster. The only thing is I can see it in the call. I think it just takes a while for the big screen here.
Okay.
So maybe, let me see what I need to do here. I don't really know how to put it there.
It's making me quit and reopen Teams. So I don't know if somebody else wants to go during this time while I'm getting kind of set up. I apologize for the delay on this one. Give me 1 second.
No worries. So meanwhile, the next person would be you, yeah. I could see your poster here.
Yeah.
For some reason, it's just not putting up there yet.
Still showing?
No. All right, so maybe let's go back to Claire. Yeah, we can see everything now, Claire.
You're muted, by the way, Claire.
Alrighty, thank you guys so much. I apologize for the delay. Michaela gave a great introduction for the poster that I will be presenting on today. I will be talking about kind of the application of relational density theory and the idea of coherence of relational frames to the to autism stigma. And so whenever we're looking kind of at the public's understanding of autism stigma and its traits, we see that there is a low understanding of the etiology of autism itself, and that can contribute to the development of stigmatization towards autistic peoples. And another thing that Kayla gave a great introduction about the relations and the coherence of relational frames. And what we sought to do within the study was to evaluate the strength of the relational frames surrounding autism stigma through kind of the same procedures or similar procedures that were used in that previous study as well. So we had 24 undergraduate students that were recruited from Missouri State University, and they completed a 14-item multidimensional scaling procedure, and that is that where you're presented with two stimuli and you're asked to relate those terms on a degree of from a scale of 1 to 10. And so that relatedness can then be put into, of all those terms in those pairwise combinations, can be put into a geometric space like we've seen previously as well with the two studies. And so this multidimensional scale included 14 terms. We had 3 appetitive and 3 negative. And so the appetitive were healthy, integrated, and capable, whereas the negative were unhealthy, outcast, and deficient. And these terms are kind of grabbed from previous papers that were talking about kind of how people relate or how people talk about disability in general, and how there are certain positive and negative terms that we use to talk about those as well. We included the labels of average person as well as autistic person, and we chose to use identity first language within the study, as this is kind of consistent with what the autistic community has asked for, as well as with previous research looking at kind of the relational frames around autism stigma. It's found that what we found was there was a minimal difference between the identity first and person first language as well. So we chose to go with what the community has asked us to as well. We also added in the highly stigmatizing terms of low functioning autistic person and high functioning autistic person. And then we had 4 novel names instead of kind of the novel stimuli that Michaela used. We used novel names that were then assigned to a specific neurotype or diagnosis of autism or non-autistic. And those 4 names were Max, Taylor, Riley, and Sam. And then Riley and Sam were the names that were trained to be the autistic names. And so that was done during a B to A stimulus pairing observation procedure. And so they were presented with the name as well as the neurotype kind of in a random or in a consecutive order to be able to train those as well. After that was completed, or I guess before that was completed, participants read a narrative of autism or about an autistic person. However, it didn't mention specifically that the person was autistic. It just mentioned a lot of characteristics that were commonly associated with autism. After participants completed the B to A training, they were then randomly assigned to 2 groups, and either one group received 4 facts that were deficit-based surrounding autism. So these included like, this person cannot go into loud stores because it's too loud, or this person cannot, or this person does not participate in conversation or does not participate in social conversation. Whereas in the other group, they received 8 facts, and they received the same 4 facts as the previous group, but in addition, they added 4 strength-based facts. So these included, this person uses headphones to go into the store to be able to complete their daily needs. Very kind of focused on how accommodations and how different things can be framed as strength-based as opposed to deficit-based. And so these were our 2 groups. And we can see down with the arrows down at the bottom, kind of the progression of the study. So they filled out that MDS, and then they also filled out a biased response survey, which included kind of being able to discriminate between an autistic person, or who they would prefer, between an autistic person and an average person. And then this was also included with negative descriptors. And so it was either an autistic person described as an outcast, unhealthy, or deficient, or it was an average person described as outcast, unhealthy, or deficient. And then the participants received the autistic narratives, the B to A SPOP training, as well as the B to C SPOP training. And then finally, they finished with the MDS and the biased response again to have that post-test before going into debriefing. So on the top right, we have the figures of the geometric spaces of the results. In the pretest, what we can see is that there is a clustering of the negative and the positive characteristic labels. And what we see is that high functioning and low functioning are still kind of stigmatized between those 2 clusters, with autistic person hanging out kind of in the middle, and average person clustered positively with those positive characteristics. And then we see the novel names kind of clustering off to the side, as they haven't gone through that training yet to assign those. In the post-test MDS with the control group, this is the group that received the 4 negative facts, or 4 deficit-based facts. And what we can see here is that there's still kind of a spreading out of the information, but we do see kind of the disruption of the frames slightly, but we do see the clustering of autistic person and then the names that were coded with autistic with those negative facts as well. And in the experimental group, this is the group that received 4 negative facts and 4 strength-based facts. What we see is we see an even tighter clustering of those terms, and we see an even tighter cluster with the names in the average person label, as well as the autistic person label. Moving on to the biased response, we were able to kind of show significant results for the control group. However, no statistically significant results were gathered for the experimental group. And so what we can say that, or it's difficult to say about the change within the experimental group. However, the control group did show significant change. And overall, what these kind of results indicate is that people have strong existing relational frames around autism, and when new information, and when the group that had the more information that's added to their network about an autistic person, it's being evaluated through existing relational frames instead of disrupting those frames. And so with a training such as this, it didn't aid in the disruption of the relational frames around autism stigma, but it leads into a good kind of talking point about how strong these relational frames around autism and how we might start going about disrupting them. And so future research can look to evaluate methods such as increased dosage, as well as the addition of diffusion-based strategies to help disrupt these frames. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions, Scott? Right, folks, let's move on to the next person. Should be Caitlin.
it showing up on?
Yep.
I'll try to zoom in because it's so far away. There we go. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Caitlin Bowers. I'm a first-year PhD researcher here. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from your part of the world. I'm from Illinois, so it's nice to see some faces from back home. But I'm just going to give a brief overview of my thesis, which is focusing on analyzing cross-cohort differences in socioeconomic position and mental health using latent class analysis. So, as a bit of background, and as I'm sure you're all aware, experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage in early life is associated with poor mental health, particularly for children and adolescents. And one of the findings that's pretty consistent in the literature is that different indicators of socioeconomic position, so things like income, housing tenure, education, all have differential relationships with these mental health outcomes. In particular, a lot of research suggests that low income and low parental education are pretty strongly related to adolescent internalizing and externalizing symptoms. But we're starting to see more research about housing tenure and some other indicators that show pretty strong associations as well. But one of the more interesting things that has shown up in research in recent years is that the relationship between these indicators of socioeconomic position and mental health is changing over time. And there seems to be an increase in the strength of the association between things like low income and then adolescent mental health in more recent generations. But a lot of this previous research has some limitations that we're hoping to address in my thesis, one of which is the fact that if we're using different cohorts, different longitudinal cohorts, we're kind of limited by the fact that often the same questionnaire is not used in each cohort because things get revised and updated, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the other thing just has to do with some theoretical and analytical issues that we're hoping to address with latent class analysis. So in my study, we'll be using 3 British birth cohorts. So we have one of children born in 1970, another born in the early 1990s, and then the last one is children born in the early 2000s. So we have about a 50-year window that we can look at changes in the socioeconomic context and then mental health as well. And because all of the research so far has supported the fact that different indicators are not necessarily interchangeable in terms of their relationship with mental health, it's better to use several indicators to try to establish like a socioeconomic context. So what we had to do for our study is go through all of these cohorts and try and find an age where similar measures were collected in all 3 cohorts. Often they weren't the same exact measure, but they had to be comparable, so available for harmonization. So this is an example of like the figure that in the bottom right, where we had to look at where things start to line up in order to find similar measures. So for socioeconomic position, we have 5 indicators that were available at similar time points. So at ages like 10 to 12, we have household income, housing tenure, parental education, parental social class. And then a little bit later in adolescence, we have subjective financial difficulties around ages 16 to 18. And we harmonize these variables and split them into binary indicators for latent class analysis. So as an example of how we did this with household income, we created a sum of all of the sources of income in a household. So benefits, salary, self-employment, that was created a single sum score. That was then equivalized by the number of people in the household, so number of children, number of adults. And then that distribution was split into quintiles, and then we split those quintiles into 2. Basically, the lowest quintile became one group, and then the other quintiles became the other. And we did this with all 5 indicators and tried to make them as comparable as possible. And the reason for doing latent class analysis mostly has to do with the structure of socioeconomic position as a construct. We know that it's a multi-dimensional construct, and there are multiple prestige and resource-based indicators. So prestige would relate to things in a hierarchy, so social class, education, whereas resource-based indicators are things like income or housing tenure, has to do with capital or access to resources. And each of these indicators are related to each other, but they're not overlapping. So you couldn't take income and replace it with education in the study and get the same results. And often what people have done in previous research is run regression-based models to try to estimate the independent effect of one of these indicators while controlling for the other ones. And the reason this is kind of problematic analytically is because in regression-based models, we are mutually adjusting. So removing the variance of other indicators to get the partial effect or the independent effect of one. So for example, if we wanted to estimate the effect of education, we would have to remove all the variance of housing and income, but as you can see, they share some variance. So that's the area that's the variance that's more central to the construct of socioeconomic position. And it removes not only the unique variance from those other indicators, so areas marked like A2 and A3, but it also removes the shared variances, areas marked B and C. So we're left with a pretty uninterpretable independent effect, but it's not really an independent effect. It's more this unique variance. So to overcome this, we're using latent class analysis, which instead of controlling for all these different variables, we're looking for patterns in the data. So this is not a variable-centered approach, it's a person-centered approach. So the unit of analysis is at the person level instead. And it uses people's pattern of responses to these socioeconomic indicators and then clusters them based on similar responses. So people who report high levels of advantage on all these indicators would be in one group, another who report disadvantage in all these indicators would be in another potentially, and then maybe a third shows kind of a pattern of advantage on some and disadvantage on others. So you can see a kind of more broad view of socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. And then we can use those latent classes to predict mental health outcomes. And coming back to the idea that we're using different cohorts, they don't use the same scales because they've been updated and revised. We're not using the same scales that we were using in the 1970s. So we have to use something called retrospective harmonization, which I won't bore you with necessarily because it's a lot of statistics, and Owen's much better at discussing it than me. But basically, we can find two items that we think measure the same underlying construct, so maybe two items relating to low mood, and then test them to see if they have the same relationship with the underlying construct of depression. And if we can suggest that like two items are measuring this underlying construct in a similar way, we can be pretty well assured that if we see any differences in symptoms, it's not due to the way that people are interpreting these questions. It's not due to like differences in the scales themselves. It's due to actual changes in symptoms. And one of the major limitations of previous research is they've skipped this step entirely or just bypassed it. An exception to that is one of Owen's recent papers, which did use retrospective harmonization. And these three cohorts, as well as one from 1958, and they found that housing tenure, specifically social housing or rented housing, is much more strongly related to adolescent internalizing and externalizing symptoms in the 2000s cohort compared to the ones previous. So we're basically repeating this, but with latent class analysis instead. And we're also looking at other psychological outcomes, antisocial and offending behavior, as well as substance use, to kind of get a broad understanding of the epidemiology of adolescent psychological outcomes in relation to socioeconomic disadvantage over the past 50 years. But yeah, that's a whistle-stop tour. If there's any questions.
Thank you. Right, so let's move on then to the next person.
All right, let me get this pulled up really quickly. Okay, is everybody able to see this okay? Awesome, okay. So my name is Stephanie Vickroy, and I will be presenting on predicting relational learning outcomes following peak instructions with autistic learners. So the Promoting of the Emergence Advanced Knowledge, or PEAK, relational training system is a curriculum that is designed as a comprehensive approach to ABA therapy, which embraces traditional verbal behavior accounts of basic language and incorporates contemporary strategies that promote relational responding, which includes stimulus equivalence and relational learning that allows for derived responding. The PEAK Comprehensive Assessment is the standardized direct assessment of verbal operant learning, equivalence-based learning, and relational learning used to gauge repertoire abilities and their. So the purpose of the study was to assess the learning modalities utilized to evaluate overall impact of intervention on thinking, understanding, and cognition skills. So for our participants, we had 60 autistic learners receiving ABA services. They were assessed using a pre-post analysis. The hours of service ranged from 4 to 30 hours per week, while the age of participants ranged from 3 to 13 years. The pre-post analysis was used to examine performance across a 6-month intervention period. So our first graph shows an average increase of 30 points from the initial PCA to the post-test PCA. And we can see clear improvements across all 4 modules of PEAK, which are highlighted as green for the direct training module, red for generalization, blue for equivalence, and yellow for the transformation module. This supports the implementation of programming across all 4 PEAK modules simultaneously. In a multiple regression analysis, we found that the primary correlated items with the PCA change score were age at test 1, meaning the younger the age predicts greater improvement.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you real quick there? Sorry.
No, you're fine.
We can see you. Sorry to interrupt. We can see your poster in the call, but people in here can't see your.
I think it's because she shared directly from
Share
PowerPoint
screen.
instead of sharing on Teams. Maybe that might help.
What do you mean? Like.
So there's an option in PowerPoint to just click present in Teams, and when you do that, it doesn't pop up on mine.
All right, so maybe
So
that's
you
it.
have to like share from Teams instead.
So if you could just please, for just a quick minute, stop sharing, and then go to the Teams call, and go to share next to the leave button in the top right corner.
Okay, give me 1 second. Let me see if I can. Okay, so share by the leave. I'm there.
Yeah, and then click share and go to your either screen or file or window, whatever works best. But then I think we're going to be able to see it here.
Can you see it now? Is this better?
Actually, no. So sorry. Did you share your screen or window, or because maybe you
Yeah.
should try some other one.
Okay, let me see what I can do. Okay.
Because everybody in the call can actually see it. The problem is people in the room, we just can't see on the screen.
Okay. Let me see.
All right, we can see it now.
Okay, let me
We
pull
can
it
see
up.
our screen.
Okay, can you like the full? There we go.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can see the whole screen. So if you just try to go to
Okay.
present from your screen.
Perfect. Alrighty. Let's see. Why am I? There we go. Is that better?
Now, yeah. Perfect. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay. I'm glad we got it figured out. Okay. So yes. So we can see a change in PCA score across all 4 modules in this graph here, which is green for direct training, red for generalization, blue for equivalence, and yellow for the transformation module. And so there was an average increase of 30 items within the PCA. And then in the multiple regression analysis, it was found that age, so the younger at test 1, the higher increase to test 2, and then the number of programs mastered were combined to produce moderate to strong predictors of change, which was an R of 0.5 approximately. So what was interesting enough about this analysis is that what we found that were not predictors of change were the number of treatment hours as well as autism symptomology were not predictors of change. So the findings suggest that a strong advocacy for early intervention with the goal of mastering programs as well as as opposed to a focus on treating autism symptomology with the increase of hours were shown to be more significant in related to PCA scores. So future research may expand on this present study with the future analysis of the pre-post PCA score within a 12 or 18-month period, as well as the research in discovering more efficient ways to mastering programming and using that relational learning. So yeah, thank you. Sorry about all the the craziness.
No, sorry for not wording you hard enough, actually.
Okay. I'm glad we got it figured out.
Yeah. Any questions?
I missed a little bit of it. When you were talking about giving the test to the children, was it the same teacher or was it different teachers? Because that can be a difference, you know, in how well the teacher is versed in ABA practices. A parent versus a teacher.
Yeah, so all of the ABA services were implemented by RBTs within the emergent learning centers with peak programming.
Okay. Sorry, I just missed that bit.
No, you're good. I don't think I mentioned it, so that's a great question.
Nobody else? No? Next poster then. I think it's you, yeah.
So, everybody, my name is Kieran Hall, and this is part of a paper which is currently up for review in the psychological record, which I call the effects of social labels on transfer function among Pullman sibling. This paper was wrote alongside Dean Reid, Professor McCain, and Dr. Robert Bones, all of Ulster University. So, within this series of experiments, we wanted to expand upon a study done previously by Keenan et al. In 2020, under the same title, commonly referred to as the Rotten Apples paper. So within that study, they wanted to explore how a simple social label, such as Yim is a good person, Yim is a bad person, Yim is neither, could manipulate how individuals distribute tokens among 2 3-member equivalence classes based purely on that label. So within the original study, they established the classes and then they tested each label in one set sequence. So they tested Yim is good, Yim is bad, Yim is neither. Then COVID came about and we saw an opportunity to explore 2 different variables which was skipped in that original paper. So the first variable we wanted to explore was the order that the labels are assigned in. So across 3 experiments, we tested 3 separate sequences. So in the first experiment, the labels were assigned good, bad, good, neither, bad, good, bad. And then the second one, we reversed it, so it was bad, good, neither, good, bad, good. And then the third one, we began with the neither label and then proceeded into good, neither, so on and so forth. But what we also did was, given COVID, we could not do face-to-face experimentation. So we utilized an old method. We went paper and pencil. We adopted a procedure established by ICASF in 1997, conferred as the paper and pencil protocol. So each participant received a massive, huge paper wallet with something like 15 envelopes inside it with all the individual experimental materials included. So across 12 phases, the first 3 phases, I'm going to zoom in here just so you can see. So phases 1 to 3 was training of the baseline relations. So for example, in phase 1 was A to B, phase 2 B to C. Then phase 3 they were tested for B to C and C to B emergent relations. Then the social functions were assigned. So this is an example from the first experiment. So in phase 4 they were told Yim was a good person, and within 6 envelopes there was 6 individual cards, and they were told to distribute 21 tokens how they saw appropriate by writing the number on each card. So then next phase went into bad, then good, and neither, and this proceeded across the sequence. Before at phase 12 they were retested again to measure if the equivalence relations had been maintained throughout. So this is the results we got for the first experiment. So this was the good function first, and as you can clearly see, class 2, which Yim was part of, which was where the label was assigned, class 2 as a whole received more than class 1, with Yim receiving the most consistently overall. Then when we go to experiment 2, when the function was reversed, so was the distribution. So class 1 this time received the highest, with Yim now receiving the least among all 6 stimuli. And again, in experiment 3, when the label was assigned neither, what we found was during neither phases, the distribution was relatively equal among the classes. So no one stimulus consistently received more than any other stimulus. And these same patterns were seen across all 3 experiments, regardless of the pattern, or sorry, the sequence that the labels were assigned. And so from this here, what we really argued was that the simple social label, basically as simple as saying someone's good or bad, that can affect not only how that person interacts with, but how those people who are associated with that person can be interacted with. And that is my shot glass version of my paper.
Yeah. Any questions? We are starting to kind of run out of time, so if we want to listen to Brianna quickly before we move on to the next link, actually, so Jordan can speak.
Sorry, just give me one moment and I'll pull it up.
Okay, we can see it.
Perfect. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to leave it in the PowerPoint mode because I'm going to zoom in so you can see the sections a little bit better. But hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Lee, and I will be presenting on 2 studies that I completed while at Missouri State University. But I will start my PhD studies at Ulster in the fall, so I'm really happy to be here. My studies focus on experiences of the LGBTQIA2S+ community in the United States. The first study I'm going to breeze through because it's just a simple correlational study highlighting that LGBTQIA2S+ college students are significantly less flexible, less self-compassionate, lower social support, which is not necessarily surprising. And so for the second study, we wanted to better understand some of these experiences contributing to the mental health disparity. And so we chose to go the route of exploring stereotypes based on sexuality. And so specifically, we wanted to understand stereotypes through an RFT framework as uncovering classes of relational frames that impact belief systems that then impact overt behaviors such as microaggressions and discrimination. To take it one step further, we used a relational density theory framework, which emphasizes strength of relation. So for the research method itself, like previous posters have done, we use a multidimensional scaling procedure where participants were presented with 2 stimuli, and they were asked to rate the degree of relatedness on a scale from 1 to 10. The stimuli we used were taken from previous literature on sexuality-based stereotypes. So we had a group of identity stimuli, which were straight man, straight woman, gay man, lesbian woman, bisexual man, and bisexual woman. We also included several descriptor words found to be common stereotypes, and these were feminine, masculine, promiscuous, monogamous, unnatural, natural, athletic, artistic, confused, and realistic. Participants were presented with every possible combination of stimuli so that when we had all of the data, we were able to produce relational distances between every stimulus, and these distances were then taken to create geospaces, which illustrate relational networks where smaller distance between data points represent greater relatedness. And so the first graph is the combined group responses at time 1. I'll zoom in so you can see a little better. And so this graph kind of shows two main findings. The first one is that there are two broad clusters of relational frames. The first includes the stimulus straight man, as well as descriptors like natural, realistic, athletic, monogamous, and masculine. And then we have a cluster of others, including stimuli such as straight woman, feminine, artistic, and all of the LGB identities. And so with this, a second observation, if you take a closer look, is that straight woman is pulling closer to the straight man cluster in comparison to any of the LGB identities. And so these findings illustrate patterns of androcentrism, where male is viewed as the default gender, as well as heteronormativity, where heterosexuality is seen as the default sexual orientation. And so after getting all of this data at time 1, the control group completed a reading passage on sea turtles. And as you can imagine, there were no differences in relational responding after this intervention. And so you can see time 1, kind of the same thing as the combined group responses. Time 2, not really much change at all. And then the experimental group were presented with a brief diffusion-based exercise from acceptance commitment therapy. And the exercise was focused on deliteralizing the meaning of identities and their stereotypes, and it was done completely online. And so at time 1, same thing, you see those two main groupings. And then at time 2, we can observe two main clusters of stimuli on the geospace again, but these are a little bit different. The first one includes all of the identity stimuli, including straight man, and another cluster including most of the descriptor words. And so this suggests that efforts to enhance aspects of psychological flexibility may have use in weakening relational frames involved in stereotyping. And so in conclusion, this research as a whole emphasizes a clear need for systemic change in creating a more inclusive and nurturing environment for marginalized people to exist in. Thank you.
Okay. I don't think we have any time for questions, but if anybody has any questions after Jordan's talk, we can address that. So let's move links. So I'll shut this call down. I'm just going to log out of the call and go to the next one.